So this episode I'm going to look at a famous bandit and outlaw who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. No, not Robin Hood. Pancho Villa. Hello film fans and welcome to this episode of the Sherlockian. Now, have you noticed that in a lot of classic westerns, the villains tended to be Hispanic or Mexican? It is a kind of trend, isn't it? And I suppose it says something of the fact that most people that filmed westerns, they were filmed for an American audience, often filmed in America with American actors and American directors. So I suppose it's not entirely surprising that the heroes of those particular series tended to look the way most Americans do, or at least the wealthier Americans who were likely to see the film. And it does, of course, have some basis in fact, in the sense that there was an awful lot of kind of warfare going along, a kind between Mexico and America in that kind of sort of southern states of the American peninsula. But it is nevertheless a bit unfair that the Mexicans are always typified as the villains and the Americans as the heroes. And that's why I was really interested to see a new show come to Disney Plus about Pancho Villa, called Pancho Villa, the Centaur of the North. Now, I vaguely knew something about Pancho Villa in the sense that he was a recognizable historical figure to me. I knew that he was a Mexican general and revolutionary in the kind of early 20th century, and that I knew what he looked like. He's very famous kind of look to him with the sort of the big hat and the big moustache. And I knew that he was famous for being extremely able tactician. And I knew that he was murdered. Spoilers for the show. But apart from that, didn't really know anything else about him. So I thought that with this show coming up later in the month, I thought it would be really good fun to have a look at Pancho Villa and have a look at the trailer and take a bit of a dive into it and see what we might be expected to see. Now, first of all, this show is filmed in Spanish, which obviously makes it quite difficult for me, who can't speak Spanish at all, to understand what's going on with our subtitles. And thankfully, the subtitles are very good. So you get a very good sense of what's going on in each scene, but nevertheless, it is a little bit complicated to watch before you get the hang of it. Now, I do particularly like the fact that they weren't afraid in the trailer to kind of they didn't shy away from the more brutal aspects of Villa's life. He's a person that many Mexicans at the time and still today consider like a national hero, in a same way somebody like Geronimo would be to some Native Americans. But on the other hand, like a bit like Geronimo, Pancho Villa was also guilty of some pretty heinous crimes. There were quite a few crimes against women he was involved with. Not so much personally as the fact he just kind of ordered his men to do it or turned a blind eye to various kind of terrible things that went on with cities he captured. There were also the fact he killed quite a lot of his enemies. Obviously, the Mexican War was incredibly brutal on both sides, so Villa's behaviour wasn't especially brutal in regards to everybody else, but in kind of black and white moral terms, he does seem quite a ruthless bloke. But it also shows the other side of Villa. One, the fact that he was incredibly popular among large sets of the like Mexican society, and particularly the kind of working classes, people that have been thrown off their own land to make way for big sort of haciendas. Some historians have even described Pancho Villa as being kind of anti-globalization. He's kind of a strange form of like utopian communism before communism really kicked off. He was an incredibly interesting man, and what I particularly find interesting is that while he was a revolutionary and while he was an incredibly successful general, he wasn't really a politician, in the sense that he wanted political power. He seems to have quite liked power itself, but kind of a military form of power. The kind of organising and running a country wasn't really something that appealed to him. So, despite the fact that in like 1914 and 1915 he could genuinely have been said to be the most powerful man in Mexico, he didn't actually really like getting involved in politics. He kind of it was more like a political backer, a bit like the Earl of Warwick in the Wars of the Roses in England. He was kind of like a kingmaker. He kind of back a particular politician and then get them into power. then he'd fall out with them, and then he'd back somebody else, And this went on for quite a long time, and is incredibly complicated. And I don't pretend to understand all the kind of twists and turns that resulted from that. But to go back to what I was originally saying, they give a really good impression of how popular Pancho Villa was in the trailer. There's lots of people cheering him, and you do get the sense that he's like this popular hero. The other thing I really liked is that Villa was famous, for despite being a general, he would actually often fight in the front line alongside his men. And there's a lovely shot of him sort of galloping into battle, alongside his men, firing off with his rifle and with his revolver. And that was a really really nice scene, and totally historically accurate. He did generally genuinely do things like that. It was a very kind of frontline sort of general. The other thing I particularly like is that it kind of highlights the fact that Villa, at least in his own mind anyway, started off as kind of as a bandit and then moved on to being like a revolutionary, or at least taking part in revolutions. Um, in his own mind anyway, entirely for the good of his family. And he actually says that in the trailer, which I liked. According to legend, Villa only became a bandit after he killed somebody who was harassing his sister. Now, I'm slightly skeptical of this story. I mean, it might well be true. I mean, certainly Mexico at the time was the kind of place where you could imagine that kind of thing happening. Um, and so it's not impossible, but similar kind of stories are often told about kind of famous outlaw figures, aren't they? I mean, obviously Robin Hood, um, is famous for kind of his association with Maid Marian. William Wallace, of course, did actually exist, unlike Robin Hood. Um, the story, which you're probably familiar with if you've seen the film Braveheart, about how he takes up arms against the English after the English sheriff murders his wife. Now, Wallace did kill an English sheriff, and it's the first time he really comes into kind of the historical record. But there's no evidence at all that the sheriff responsible, had actually killed Wallace's wife. We don't even know if Wallace was married. Um, and the story apparently comes about a bit later, primarily because Scottish people wanted to kind of create Wallace as this kind of Robin Hood figure, and then therefore thought they needed a Maid Marian type person in legend. Um, and I kind of suspect that Pancho Villa had a similar kind of thing going on. Um, that said, it might well be true, and it certainly I'd like the fact that it kind of picked up on this, because I mean the story could be true, and it's certainly how Villa saw himself. Um, the other thing it will probably touch on, there's a bit where you see like there's like a standoff with, well, it doesn't specifically say they're the American army, but they are referred to as gringos, so I imagine they probably are. And Villa, apart from obviously being famous as a revolutionary, as a kind of Robin Hood figure, apparently he used to redistribute the wealth he gained from his raids. Um, he was most famous after that for his attitude towards the US. They actually started a kind of border war with the Americans in 1916. So before they'd even taken part in World War One, but primarily because Villa attacked across the American border with several kind of raids, and then the American army launched their own counter raids, led by Black Jack Pershing, who later led American forces in World War One, as kind of a kind of reprisal. In fact, I think the Americans may well have won several battles against Villa. In fact, the because Villa wasn't then actually, he was by then a guerrilla kind of figure rather than actually being involved in mainstream politics. So the then government of Mexico also launched attacks on Villa because they were annoyed that he'd incited the Americans to attack them, which they didn't really appreciate. So Villa was actually kind of being attacked by both sides. Now, I don't know this, but I suspect this will probably come up at some point in the series, if not actually in this particular series. If they do another one, I could imagine that being a kind of cliffhanger at the end of the first series, because it's really interesting. Not least because the Americans are kind of responsible, globally anyway, for kind of creating the Villa mythos, because Villa obviously was very famous in Mexico, but his fame outside of Mexico came primarily because American left wing journalists who were following this war in Mexico rode alongside him and were kind of impressed by his kind of, idealism, the idea that he did genuinely seem interested in ordinary people, that he would, redistribute the wealth from some of his raids, sometimes actually taken from the Americans. Um, to ordinary people. Now, how much Vega did this, I don't know. He certainly grew very wealthy himself, so he can't have given away all his wealth. But then again, I can't imagine that the myth was based entirely on fiction, though I suspect stories like Robin Hood may well have helped create that kind of mythos because it kind of played into the journalist's hands. It makes the story so much better, doesn't it? If you say, this bandit, is giving wealth to the poor, people immediately think of Robin Hood, and that immediately makes the story far more interesting. Um, so I suspect there's a little bit of kind of fact versus fiction going on here. But I really like the fact that that's what the film or the series seems to be trying to go for, to kind of analyze the myth, to say how much of it is really true and how much ultimately does that really matter, because it's a great story. So I really like that. The other thing is, it does show kind of the ruthless side of Via. It doesn't just airbrush him. Um, I particularly like the scene at the end of the trailer when he shoots a man. I was going to say in cold blood. I get the sense there's kind of a standoff going on, and it's a nice little sort of Western kind of pastiche where he draws his revolver and shoots a man multiple times, and then he turns around and you see he's holding an ice cream in the other hand, and he just kind of like licks it and walks off. Um, and I like this scene. As far as I know, it's not based on anything that actually happened in real life. But it does sound similar to something that one of his lieutenants did. And when apparently he shot a man just to see whether he'd fall forwards or backwards, which I do quite like. And hopefully we'll actually see that scene at some point in the show because that's a really kind of wonderfully spine chilling episode that apparently actually happened. But ultimately, I'm really looking forward to watching this and reviewing it a bit more in detail. It looks really good and it illuminates a historical figure that, while I had heard of him, is not terribly well known, I would imagine, outside of Mexico or America. He's certainly not the kind of person that somebody would have heard of, or unless they're a geeky historian like me, would have heard of him if they're in Europe. So I think it's a really interesting kind of choice to look at him. So yeah, that was my review of the trailer for Pancho Villa, the Centaur of the North, which is a really odd name, isn't it? I wonder if there's some kind of mistranslation in there. But anyway, if you've got anything else you'd like me to review, historically themed or otherwise, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.